Our next speaker is Professor Brian Beatty. He's a professor of instructional technologies in the Department of Equity, Leadership Studies and Instructional Technologies at San Francisco State University. Brian's primary areas of interest and research include social interaction in online learning, flipped classroom implementation, and developing instructional design theory for hybrid flexible learning environment. At SF State University, Dr. Beatty pioneered the development and evaluation of Hyflex course design model for blended learning environments, implementing a student-directed hybrid approach to better support student learning. Dr. Beatty has more than 25 years experience as a classroom teacher, trainer, and instructional designer at school businesses and the US Navy. Professor Beatty, over to you. Take it away.
All right. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak today at this wonderful gathering. I was just listening to much of the Q&A from the last session. You have, excellent questions, and I hope that you're able to get some answers to some other questions, perhaps in this session. But I also invite your questions through the Q&A. I know we have a bit of a limited time today, but I'm also very willing to respond if you have other questions through email or any other means where we might have some communication about these. I'm very, very excited about what we've been doing with Hyflex in our own program for a long time, quite honestly, almost more than 15 years now. But what we've seen really happening around the world, especially the last 2 or 3 years, as we've all become much more aware of the need for our students to have some flexibility in how they participate in the learning experiences that we provide. And what that typically means is they need access and they need schedule flexibility, which means we need to have some online options, but without giving up the classroom options, because we know sometimes the classroom is a much better learning place for some of the content, but also for some of the students, the cases differently. But I get ahead of myself a little bit. I'm going to share a presentation with you. And the presentation has also been shared with the organizers. And so I don't know if we'll get through all this, but there's information in here that I'll talk through relatively quickly. And there's more that you can look at afterwards, especially if you have interest in seeing some things or maybe clicking on some links that I haven't had a chance to share. So today I was going to briefly talk a little bit about how the education shift is happening that we've all been seeing, and what is Hyflex design, to make sure we're all clear when that term is used. What does it mean and what does it not mean? And thinking about how we might use Hyflex or similar approaches, really flexible design approaches, to help our students and through our students help our institution. We have institutional goals that might be better met when we're able to better serve students with better access and even higher quality access in some cases. And of course, we always have challenges and opportunities, and we'll take some time to. I'll mention some of those for you, and I imagine that you will probably have other questions, and oftentimes they are around the challenges and the opportunities. All right, so why Hyflex? Why hybrid flexible courses? And that's this whole idea. We started this a long time ago because we had a graduate program here in the U.S. in the San Francisco area, and we had declining enrollments. This was in the 2005 timeframe, and so we had an economic downturn, 2002, 2003, and we were still seeing the impact of that. And as the economy gets rolling again, what we find in graduate education is oftentimes we have reduced enrollment because people are back at work. They don't have the time for graduate programs, nor necessarily do they need them to find jobs if they already have jobs. So we found this decline in enrollment, and our department chair came to a meeting among the faculty and told us that he thought our solution to a decline in enrollment was to take our 25-year face-to-face program that was built up over many years and had a wonderful reputation in the area and turn it into a fully online program. And the faculty, we just looked at each other because we didn't teach online classes. None of us had ever taught an online class. Very few of us, if any, had ever taken an online class. So this was a brand new thing to us, as well as our students weren't online students. They liked the classroom, and they were students who could find the time. They had the resources to be there in person. So this radical shift did not seem to us to be something that would be very workable. So I suggested that maybe we could come up with a compromise solution where we would be able to change the way we teach, so we could bring in some online students to help our enrollment into our face-to-face classes, because we did not want to give up the face-to-face instruction and learning environment. And so that was the why that pushed me towards finding a solution for our department, so that we could meet the enrollment needs and not give up the high quality design and the interaction that we were liking to have with our students. So I did that for a semester. I dabbled it with a class. I tried a few sessions. It worked reasonably well as we figured out what was going to work and what was not working. The next semester, I took one whole class and created a Hyflex version of that course and offered that. That was very successful. And then the semester after that, so like 3 semesters into this, I finally was teaching all of my classes Hyflex. And then over a number of years, the rest of the department, the faculty started teaching in Hyflex, or some of them actually shifted over to online. We had a few faculty who kept teaching just classroom because of what they were teaching. So what we found was that students did participate in all modes. They were satisfied with their learning, and we didn't see any measurable grade or learning difference at the data we were looking at. And you can, if you're interested in that, you can do some searching. Actually, this URL up here, the Hyflex Learning Community, has a bibliography that has about 150 different papers, dissertations, master's theses, conference proceedings, a whole range of papers that you can look at to see where we have been doing research and where many others have been doing research. So why is this a global movement now? What has happened? Well, we've always had this problem. Sometimes we call this a wicked problem, because it's very difficult to solve. There's no single solution to this problem of having equitable access to high quality instruction for everyone who needs it and who wants it. And then the other challenge that's part of this problem is, how do we get there, whatever that there might be, from where we are? We can't just stop our, well, you wouldn't think we could just stop the way we do higher education and restart it in 3 weeks with a whole different approach. Now, actually, I have to question whether or not we could or couldn't. We just did that, many of us, in 2020, but that's not something we would ever choose to do, right? So we need to get there from where we are, and we don't want to just a lot of things that we've been doing have been working very well for many students, but they're not working well for all students. Not everyone has access, and even when they do have access, it's not necessarily access with equity. They're not necessarily reaching the same learning outcomes because of the way our systems are set up, and maybe the way that we know how to teach that way. And so there's some quality differences that we might see. And so that's something that we want. Any solution path we came up with, we wanted to make sure we were addressing access, we were addressing quality, we were addressing equity. And there's a lot of different ways of looking at equity, but we're thinking about equitable learning outcomes first and foremost. But then we have the whole concepts of equity, inclusion, and belonging, where we're reaching out to students who maybe haven't been part of our classrooms before. And so those might be students from different economic levels or geographic levels or areas, from different home lives, from different social environments where maybe education is not something that their community or their family has really been supportive of. We want them to be included. We want them to belong. So this is you can see this is a challenge, right? This is a big challenge. And so I think that there's a path to follow, or at least to consider following. And our path has gone through the hybrid flexible course designs, and many hundreds, if not thousands, of institutions around the world have been looking at this and finding ways to make this work for some, if not all, of their faculty and their students. The problem we have with the individual courses, the answer is not just, well, if you want access, just create online courses, right? That doesn't work for everybody. Any of these single mode classes, like the classroom, we are cutting some students out of the opportunity because they can't be there, either location-wise or time-wise. They have other conflicts. It could be work commitments, it could be family commitments, it could be they live too far away, or they don't have regular access to transportation, or it's too costly. So they're not able to be in our course, in our classes. If you look at your classes today in the classroom, these are students who you won't see because they can't be there. and yet we still want, and sometimes we're mandated to serve them. We have to find ways to do that. So enter the online courses. Online synchronous. The world went online synchronous to a large extent in spring of 2020 and stayed there for at least a semester, maybe 2 or 3 semesters. But not everyone had access to that. We saw that. And even when they had access, it wasn't always quality access, right? There was a lot of good learning and teaching that was going on in the online synchronous space in the last few years. But there was also some relatively poor teaching because of poor technology or poor design. And there were students who didn't necessarily know or want to be in that situation. And so sometimes they would log in and they would check out. Just a black box on the screen, no microphone, no camera. Did they learn anything? Who knows? And then, of course, we have the online asynchronous courses. A lot of us have had these for many years, and they often work very well. We've had programs, online programs, for decades, several decades, in many of our institutions and courses especially. And oftentimes the students learn quite well, but there are also lots of students who are not a good fit for that. They don't have the technology, or they don't have the skills, or they don't have the interest in learning primarily independently. And so essentially they don't have quality access that way. So the point is that any one of these single mode courses cuts out some students. And so I think we should be looking for ways to find course designs that allow us to give access to students in any one of these modes, or at least 2 of the modes, face-to-face, and 1 of the online modes, so we give them legitimate choices. Hybrid flexible course design, or Hyflex, just came up. I had to have a term for my first proposal for a conference to talk about this, and this term seemed to be the one that made the most sense to me. It's a hybrid course. It's a mix of face-to-face and online activities, online paths, and at least 1 online path, maybe 2. And then a face-to-face path, and flexible. Just having multiple modes, I think, is important. But during a semester, during the course, the length of time that a class is being taught to students, things happen in students' lives that change their ability to be there in person or to participate well online. It could be the content. Content gets extremely confusing. They've been trying to learn online. They're not doing well. They need a place to come where they can get more customized and individualized support, and that's usually in the classroom. All right, or they're happy learning in the classroom, but now something changes. They have to take care of a family member that they didn't have to take care of before, or their work schedule changed, or they get that job, or they have to relocate. Maybe it's even just 60 kilometers away, or it could be in another country. What about those students? Can we keep them learning? And that's where the online options often come to play. So that flexibility is not something that I, as an instructor, could predict, other than predicting that almost every student will need flexibility. I can't tell which week from week to week, which student needs to be online, which student needs to be in person. I have to leave that choice up to them. And that's what Hyflex is about. That's why it's so different. It's not just multimodal. It's multimodal, and the modes are chosen by the students. And so it really does become a student-directed hybrid. That's why I sometimes use that term. So this is a picture that was created by EDUCAUSE a number of years ago. And I like it because I like the center of this, which is really representing to me the course. It's a single course. It's a single learning community, but we have multiple paths for participation. We have the classroom path and we have the online path. And sometimes that online path is asynchronous, sometimes it's synchronous, and sometimes it's either one. At our campus, we actually leave that up to the faculty to decide which online paths do you want to offer, but we always require them to have a face-to-face path as well. I'm not going to take the time to play this, but if you want to listen to this short little video, it's about 80 seconds or so, but it does a good job of explaining, basically the idea of Hyflex is relatively simple. It becomes more complex in implementation, as you might imagine. Many of our wonderful ideas in education of doing things differently are not that complicated at the surface level, but once you start doing it, like flipping a classroom, a simple idea, have students prepare on their own, and then they come to class and they do these application activities. Not a very difficult concept to grasp, but actually working it out and helping students learn how to learn differently and learning how to teach a little differently as well. That's where the complication comes in. Same thing with Hyflex. The Hyflex Learning Community site, like I mentioned up here, is a place where you can actually watch this video, and the link is here on the slide. And this is, and the reason I put this here is because it's something you could easily share with someone who says, Hyflex, what is that? Take a look at the video. It'll explain it really quickly. So why would we do Hyflex? Why do we do this? Here are some of the advantages that we see, and there are probably many more you might think of in your own situation. But basically, the primary advantage for students is that they have flexible ways to access the opportunities to learn. And so they don't have to be in person on campus at the same time and place every week or every Tuesday or whatever it might be. They also don't have to always be online asynchronous learning. If they have the opportunity to be on campus, they can choose to be that way, to participate that way. But that allows them to make more decisions. That actually gives them more agency in their learning. They can learn how to take more responsibility for those choices, but that's something they usually need to be supported in, right? Your expert learners will have no problem making that choice. Your naive learners, your learners who don't really understand how they learn best, will need some help and support in making those decisions. And so you might actually put up some guardrails around that. So maybe they have to prove their learning motivation before they get full access to online, or maybe they can have full access, but then at some point you make a determination 3 or 4 weeks in, it seems like your learning is not very strong. We think you should consider coming into the classroom or at least joining us synchronously. So you might have some limitations on that, but that's a local decision. That's a very context bound decision. So if we give students access like this and the ability to choose, they can actually have much less schedule conflict. How many students do you know who wanted to take your class at 10 o'clock on Wednesday, but found that, I'm sorry, I have to work from 8 till 12 every day, so I can have food for myself and for my family. I can't be at your 10 o'clock class. Well, these schedule conflicts can be somewhat resolved, and the conflict's not just obviously with out of the university or out of the college conflicts. It's also with other classes. Often the students want to take 2 classes and they have a competition for their time. They're both on Tuesday at 9:45. Maybe there's only a 5 or 10 minute overlap of these classes, but our systems would not let them enroll in both because there's an overlap. Well, with a Hyflex course, students could take one of them, at least for part of the time, fully online and participate that way instead of in person. So you could resolve some of these conflicts. You might find that enrollment in courses might increase because now more students have access. This is what we have found in several situations, and lots of colleges have done this, especially recently, the last year, to recover some of their enrollment that they lost during the pandemic season, when many of our students went away and a lot of them never came back, right? So they're finding that if they give students more flexible ways to participate in classes, they actually are recovering some enrollment. Students might actually find that there are different programs that are available to them, and different groups of students who may live, maybe they're just on the edge of what you would consider your regional, your region area. And those students on the outer edges probably aren't coming in very big numbers because it's difficult for them to get there. Well, you might actually find that now you can reach out to students who are in different locations, maybe even farther away than that, like a typical online student, and then let them know, hey, even though you're not likely to be here, if you are in the area for the class, you're welcome to be here. There is a seat reserved for you, or at least that you would have access to. Students might actually learn better when they can make a decision at the beginning of a day. I don't feel up to being on campus today, or I've got these other things going on. If I had to be on campus, it would be very stressful for me, and that would probably have an impact on the way I learn that day in the course and the class. So I'm going to choose to be online. And so when you give them that freedom to make that choice, sometimes they feel like they are more appreciated, right? And then they feel a little bit more connected to the class, to the faculty member, maybe even to the institution. Maybe they're more satisfied with their experience. Does that satisfaction lead to a little different experience for them? I think it does. I think it's difficult to measure, but I do think that there are things going on in the way students think and feel in their emotional states when they're in our classes that might be better if we didn't force them there, if it really wasn't the best place for them that particular day. And another thing, faculty, we can design for high quality teaching and hopefully learning in each of the participation paths. If we have the time to design, if we have the skills to design, we can do this. And what this does then is it gives us basically 2 or 3 paths for students to participate that we can be confident in. If we can find ways to manage the workload, the building the materials, but also facilitating in these various modes, we can find. I think we find that I feel like I'm a much better instructor than I was 20 years ago, not just because I'm older and I have some gray hairs, but because I've learned how to be much more flexible with my students and let them know that learning is the outcome that we're shooting for. And you choose the mode, but in that mode, here's what you get to do, right? I still have the designed path for them. And so I'm confident that they'll learn in any mode, which means that if they start moving into directions I wasn't expecting, or maybe don't help me as a teacher, I like to teach students in the classroom. But if I have a class where everyone chooses to be online for whatever reason, if I'm confident they can still learn that way, then it just becomes me managing my own emotional, maybe a little bit of dissatisfaction because now no one's in classroom with me and I don't get to be there because I know they're not going to be there that day. Now I'm going to teach them online. That's a different thing for me to be wrestling with than being concerned that students aren't learning because they're absent. Back in the day, right, when students couldn't be there in person, what would they do? They just wouldn't be there. They'd be absent that day, maybe for a week, maybe for a couple of weeks. And did you have a path for them to follow other than, okay, read the textbook, write the paper or get ready for the quiz or the test when you come back to campus? That's not really, I don't think that's adequate design. I think some students actually could learn in that way, but those are students who are good independent learners. Many of our students are not that way. The other thing we find with Hyflex is that we have essentially built in instructional continuity to the institution when the campus is not available to us. As long as we have our technology systems running, right? If we have a campus that's not available, in my area of the world, we struggle now with wildfire smoke, usually for several weeks out of every fall term. Either the campus is closed or we're really reducing the time that we're asking students to be outside. And so rather than just canceling classes for a few days, we can easily say now, okay, instead of canceling classes, all the classes are going to move back online. That doesn't mean all our classes are designed for Hyflex, but what it does mean is that our campus has become confident that we can continue teaching in the online space when the campus is not available, as long as we have our technology systems available to us. Now, not every situation we'd have technology, right? If the electrical grid was wiped out, well, we're not doing any teaching online either. But that allows us to be a lot more flexible, and the leadership of the institution doesn't have to be as concerned. Like, say there's a transit strike coming up and people won't be able to get to campus, they can still have classes working, even if it might take 2 or 3 weeks, with no trains or buses or things like that. They can still have classes going on online because we have the technologies, and most of our faculty have taught online now. And for those of us who teach Hyflex, for us, it's not a problem at all, other than the fact that, whatever's happening in the world might have an impact on our ability to teach and to learn. But technology-wise, it's already there. So if I can't be in classroom, maybe I'm the one who can't be in the classroom. It doesn't matter. I have an online path for students that they can follow, and if it's an asynchronous path, then I don't have to be there. If I'm not well enough to actually be teaching a class online, like in a Zoom space as well. So there are a lot of good reasons to do this. I think the important thing to start with and to consider and to start reshaping is, well, what would you need to do? What would be your why? Right? This is an institution decision probably at some level, but it's also, I think, a departmental or a program, and especially a faculty decision. I think we have to be convinced at every level that this is important to do. Why? Because it takes time, it takes effort, it takes resources to do this. Your technology systems might have to be improved a little bit. Your teaching abilities will have to be probably expanded. Right. And even though that may not be a bad thing for faculty, or that's not like they'd be afraid of that, it still takes time and energy to do that. And it takes effort. Right. It's important to define your approach. Our approach says you have to be in the classroom. You have to have the classroom available, and you have to have an online available. But the online, you can decide if it's synchronous or asynchronous or both. Right. So we allow part of that definition up to faculty, because on our campus, this is our context. This is what we need to do. But other campuses may do that very differently. Some will say the Hyflex class is in person and online asynchronously, and they don't talk about the online synchronous, maybe because they don't have the classroom technology to support that. Or they might say it's in person and online synchronous, but they don't talk about the online asynchronous because they may not have the time available for faculty to learn how to build an online path through their course that's of good quality, and so they would rather focus on just the synchronous in person and online. But after you define your approach, then you start developing expectations for students and for faculty. So students who are enrolling in a course like this, what is expected of them? How do we support those students? What about the faculty? What's expected of the faculty? How do we support those faculty? As I said, this is our definition. This is the third or fourth version of our definition. We started doing this when we started defining our online courses and hybrid courses officially, and said, well, what about Hyflex? We have a bunch of those. So we added those to our definition. But this is what we say. We talk about choice. We talk about face-to-face, and online. And in online, we talk about synchronous, asynchronous, or there's another term that started being used about 3 years ago, bicronous, which means a combination of synchronous and asynchronous. A little bit about technology. Part of the classroom change of of where we're going with this and changing our classrooms is around the technology that we have. We have classroom technology, we have online technology, and then we have technologies that work both in the classroom and online. And to me, this is the magic of Hyflex, or maybe one of the enablers, to use more formal language, of Hyflex, is technologies that allow us to do things with students in person and online at the same time, or have the ability to connect even asynchronous learners back into what we were doing in the live classroom or the synchronous space through technology that support recording, but then also allow students to come in after the fact to inject their comments, their notes, etc., their interactions into the same artifacts that we created when we were doing things synchronously. So classroom technology is basically the audio and visual, right, to support the students who are joining us live online, as well as to support recording what goes on in the classroom. What happens in the classroom, I think, is important in part because there's a lot of content, learning information that's generated in the discussions that we have in the classroom, not just presented by the teacher, the tutor, but also through the conversations, the questions that students raise. Every time I teach a class, every class, the classroom interactions are different than they were the time before that, and they will be in the future, because the students are different and they ask different questions. So I say different words and the students say different words. That's content that's being generated that I like to capture for everyone to learn from. So we do recording, we have transcripts for all of that. But in order to do that, we have to be able to capture the audio and the video. The audio is most important because that's where most of the information is being, that's the channel that has the most information. The video is nice to have, but that's typically something we end up with relatively small videos, often zoomed out. And so the quality is not as good from learning. If I had a class where the video was more important, like I have a whiteboard with important notes on it, I would have to have a camera to do that, or some ability to capture that, maybe a digital whiteboard to use instead of a camera solution. But I need to capture that information for the learners as well. As well, when I'm in the classroom, if I have synchronous online students, I have to be able to see them and hear them if they have something to say into the class, right? And I want them to have something to say. So they can't participate online synchronously without talking in my classes. So I have to be able to see them and to hear them well. And then we capture that. Online asynchronously, well, we have our learning management systems, of course. We use a recorded video from the classroom, but we don't rely just on that. Far from it. We have a fully developed online course path for them. So even if we didn't have a classroom meeting that week, which sometimes happens, they still have a path they can follow. They log in, and there's probably half a dozen things for them to do. They read, they watch, they write, they interact, they answer questions, they do other kinds of things. Maybe they post their own little videos about something, but that's designed as a fully online path for the class. And so that requires time and energy, but we have the skills to do that. We have online quality programs that we can use for these courses as well. It just takes time to build and to develop those skills. In the classroom, I don't want the classroom to be that different than it was before. I don't want technology used because I have synchronous learners or a recording for an asynchronous audience to have an impact, at least a great impact, on the experience of the face-to-face students. That face-to-face experience is important for them. And so if I have to have them on their laptops all the time, maybe even wearing headsets in the classroom because we're trying to get them to connect to the online synchronous students in the lab class, that changes their experience quite a bit. And I wouldn't normally do that unless it was a special thing, a special evolution or something like that. So I try to keep it as much close as possible for them. So those are some of the technologies. Here's a link you can follow if you're interested. There's an online magazine, EdTech Magazine, did a whole series of articles on Hyflex, or flexible teaching and spaces. They highlighted the room I was in for one of them. You'll see my smiling face in there a little bit, but you can take a look at that. And it's kind of a 3D one. You can kind of click through and see the various things that we're doing. I'll leave that for you to explore on your own. Design principles, real briefly. I know we're going to stop. We're going to do Q&A in just a couple of minutes here. Four principles: learner choice, or sometimes I call this alternatives, but they have to have choice for learners. And we have to give students that choice for it to be Hyflex. It could be multimodal without the flexibility. Then it's just not Hyflex. Just don't call it Hyflex. Equivalence, when I talk about the principle of equivalence, it's about learning outcomes, equivalent learning outcomes. not equivalent experiences. I mean, they should lead to equivalent learning, but it's going to be a different experience. The classroom experience is different than either one of the online experiences. The online asynchronous experience is different than any of the other synchronous experiences. You can't tell them it's not. And I don't think you would believe that anyway. Why would they believe it? But it doesn't mean it's worse. It just means it's different. We have to create opportunities for equivalent learning. Reuse is an important principle so that I like to build things once and reuse them in all modes. So I build content once. I build a lot of my engagement approaches, like interactions. I might do discussions in the class and discussions online. Sometimes I have all students doing online discussions as homework assignments, because then they get I do one activity and everybody's part of it. I don't need two activities for everything. This comes into the world of assessment as well. If I can do assessment approaches and use the same assessments for all students, then I don't have to worry about, well, what are online students doing and what are face-to-face students? What if we did it all together? That usually means out of the classroom. Accessibility is another important one. So for the accessibility, we have to make sure not only do we meet the requirements, the law, but also making sure that we provide students with as much support to get access, especially to the online spaces. If they don't have that access, do they need technology? Do they need bandwidth? Do they need skills in using those two to help them learn? Those are things that you might build into a student support program. And then there's more on here about the design that you can look through on your own. We typically look at student learning outcomes first, and then the instructional content. We look at assessment strategies and engagement strategies, and we look at the classroom, and then whatever online spaces we have, and make sure that we kind of set up grids. Here's what we're doing for assessment. Well, here's the classroom approach. Here's the online, and here's the various forms of online. And then we look to make sure that we're trying to do as much as possible as we can. All right. Okay, so I think I'm about out of time for this. Are we ready for Q&A? Is it time to move into that?
You have 3 minutes again, Professor.
Okay, and so I may show up some more slides in answers to questions that come up. That's
Okay. Okay, no problem.
Okay, so thank you very much.
So much, Professor, for that very insightful presentation. I understand really not ready to go. Maybe he has quite a lot of questions already for you, but I just want to add that it was an excellent presentation, and what I like the way you came up with Hyflex, really creative, really innovative. I like that, and it's really advantageous. And what I like too is the instructional continuity. I think that is so good, and the high level of autonomy that you give to the instructors. Similarly, students get that autonomy. And before you go to Jonathan, I have a question that I want to ask you. Have you found that Hyflex was able to increase student agency?
Well, yes, I think it naturally increases their agency because they're not being told by the institution or the faculty member anymore exactly when they have to be in class and where they have to be and for how long. Many of our students, I mean, many of us, quite honestly, we grew up in a system that always told us where to be, when to be there, and what to do while we were there. Right, so it was safe for us from the aspect of agency because we didn't have a lot of agency, right? We knew we showed up at school, we were told what to do, we were moved from room to room, and boom, as long as we were learning inside those classes, we finished things off. Now what we're saying is that we know that that doesn't work for all of our students, and so we're going to give them some choices, and so they have to make that choice. Interestingly enough, when I ask students in a couple of surveys if they preferred making their own choices, I thought I would have close to 100% of them saying, yes, thank you very much, Dr. Beatty. I like making my own choices about that. But I found that was not the case. About 84% said they liked or very much liked it. But some of them, 16%, said, actually, I don't like making that choice. And so I think they were being forced to assume some agencies that maybe they weren't prepared for. And in my mind, I was thinking at the time, well, why don't you just consider yourself a face-to-face student and take the online off the table and say, for me, I'm a face-to-face student in this class. Or for me, I'm just an asynchronous learner in this class. In my mind, that's the way I think, but they weren't thinking that way. So now at the beginning of my courses, after learning that not all of them like making the choices, we talk through what it means to make this choice and what it means if you choose to be a synchronous online learner, what are the various characteristics of that you have to be ready to accept? What are your responsibilities in that area? And the same thing for the classroom, the same thing for the online asynchronous. And so I think that they're better prepared to make that choices, but I do think it happens naturally because you're not going to make that choice for them. Now, in some situations, if you have students that you know maybe have no experience learning online, you may come in and set the expectation that we're all starting in the classroom. And then if you are able to learn well, and we've got you maybe there's some things you have to answer as far as technology and location, et cetera, to move online. Maybe you get permission to move online with the caveat that if it doesn't work well for you, you come back to the classroom. So that's kind of a ramp up to agency, right? That you could potentially use in a context where you thought it was very important. That takes away some flexibility from students at the beginning, but it might prevent you from having students who end up choosing online because it's very convenient for them, but it's not a good place for them to learn, in which case they may end up not having a successful learning experience and maybe even drop out of a class just because they had too much agency they weren't ready for. So that's one of these strategic choices about how you would deploy this at an institution or in a program or even just in a particular course. What I've always told faculty is that if you restrict the flexibility for students as you're learning how to do this and as you're learning how well they respond to it, I don't think that's a problem as long as you tell them ahead of time, here's the flexibility you have. Now, here's what you might have in the future, and here's the path to get to that. So it's any flexibility, I think, is better than no flexibility, even if it's something that they have to kind of earn. It's not quite the right word, but they have to show that they will be able to handle it. Because if we gave them opportunities to learn in a way that was just really bad for them, that would be probably unethical, right? That would not be something that we would want to be as professional educators.
Thank you so very much, Anderson.
Thank you very much to Professor Beatty
Over
and,
to
of
you.
course, and Dr. Shah. Thank you very much. So we do have a few questions coming into the chat. And the first question comes from Sebastian Narain-Singh, Professor. And he asks, does flip the classroom require independent learners? So can you
Sure.
answer the question?
Yes, there's a lot of good literature on flipping the classroom. We've been talking about that for, I don't know, is it 20 years yet? It seems like it. But what it requires is students who are willing and able and motivated to prepare out of class for the upcoming synchronous class session. Synchronous online or face-to-face typically is how that's done. And so they have to be able to prepare for your classes. I tried this with my own graduate students for a while, and I didn't continue because I found that I thought this is what I expected anyway, right? I used to teach high school math, science, and things like that, and I expected students to prepare for class so we could do problems in class, right? And so we could do the applications and answer those difficult questions. But if they didn't come prepared for class, I found the same thing with my graduate students. If they didn't do the readings before class, we couldn't talk about complex application issues. We had to talk about the basics, right? We had to go through definitions and concepts and simple things that I'd hoped that they had already prepared for that. And so that does require students to be able to do that more independently. Some of them create study groups and do it, more collaboratively, but it does require them to take on that responsibility before class so that in the class environment, in the synchronous environment, you can rely on them being able to contribute to, maybe you're doing little small group application tasks or individual things like that. So it does require students who are willing to take on that responsibility. I think that in a lot of our courses with a lot of our students, we have a mix of students. Some are willing to do that and some are not. And so I found that for me, if I was going to continue flipped classroom ideas, I'd have to almost have the opportunity to group students in the live session that were prepared, but then also have groups of students who maybe weren't so prepared, and so that they would do more basic things. Because if you take students who aren't prepared and you put them into a situation where they're asked to apply those ideas and they don't even understand the basic ideas, it's not going to work, right? They're not going to get nearly as much out of that, and that might take away from that of those students who are prepared. So that's a very long answer. I'm a professor, so I like to talk. The short answer is yes. I think it does require independent learning skills.
I think the long responses are also welcome, Professor. Don't worry. All right, so we have another question coming. In fact, your views actually, in terms of your views of the Hyflex with high school students. What are your views on that?
Yes, actually, there are some high schools in the U.S. I'm aware of that have been doing this in small parts, small aspects of what they're doing for many years. And clearly, flexibility is different at the high school level because we're working with students who are typically not adults. And so they're not usually legally able to make those participation decisions on their own. And so some of our schools will rely on a family unit, a guardian or a parent, to be part of that decision. So students may be choosing to learn online for a particular class, but they're not making the decision on their own, because someone has to be responsible for their safety, for their location, and as well as to make the legal decision that they're choosing to learn out of class. Especially the last year or so, more of our districts have added flexible choices in because they found that this would attract some students back to their schools whose family were saying they're not coming back to school, at least not right away, at least not now. So there is that going on. We also have some schools that provide the opportunity for students to learn more independently, like an asynchronous path through a course, but to be there at school while they're doing that. And so they'll have locations, in the study areas, in the library, or some other place where students can basically check in there as, okay, I'm here on campus. That meets the legal requirement for me to be here, and I'm going to be learning in this class, but I'm going to be doing it independently over here. So there are different models like that that have been set up that can work just as well. It does require either kind of a strong social environment around the student to help make sure that they are actually engaged in learning, like they were during the synchronous space. Sometimes that works well, sometimes it doesn't work so well, but that would be a requirement. Or they're at school in a space that gives them the opportunity to be either synchronously connected to a class that for some reason they don't want to be there in person for, or asynchronously learning. Some schools, especially systems of schools, are finding ways that they can use this to have students at one school taking classes at a different school when there's space available for that. They could get a course they couldn't take before, and they can join in synchronously, but they're maybe in their home campus, and then the other school could be 20 miles away, or 50 kilometers away, who knows, that they just didn't have the same class in all the campuses. I think this is one of the things that our systems of schools might find ways to find as another advantage point, where they could have specialization on a particular campus for a particular topic and have students from all the different schools that are part of the system as part of that class, even though those students are joining in remotely because they're not there on campus. Students probably wouldn't be going in and out of class flexibly like before, but it does create a multimodal environment with some flexibility that is potentially available for students. So yeah, it can work in high schools. There are some schools, of course, where some colleges, in some areas of the world where, high school is part of the college, right? You come in for 4 or 5 years, and then you get into maybe the first 2 years of what we would consider a 4-year school. It's all in the same school. And so they're finding that this is working. It's challenging. I think you have to learn how it best works with your students and your faculty and your family communities, but it certainly can work.
Okay, thank you. And I must remind all attendees, please, once you have any questions for us or questions for Professor Beatty, please use the question and answer section for putting your questions there. Okay, so as we continue, Dale, Professor, is asking if you could repeat the key strategies for effectively managing a high-flex teaching environment and ensuring both in-person and remote students. Okay, I guess this is two sections, meaning that he's asking for a repeat of the key strategies and ensuring both in-person and remote students are equally engaged and supported.
Right. So this is some of the things I would normally talk about, but I didn't really get to. But when we talk about the design aspect, we really look at these 4 areas versus the outcomes. Can all the outcomes be met in each of the modes we intend to offer? And that's almost always yes, but sometimes the answer is no. In that case, what we would say is, for example, if we have a science class that has a lecture and a lab, some of our science teachers won't teach labs online or can't teach labs online. Students have to be there in person, but the lectures can be Hyflex. And so those outcomes met by the lectures, they allow full flexibility, but then for the lab components, they might require them to be in person. So that kind of outcomes, to make sure that they would work, is an important starting point. And then the content. What content do we provide in, and how do we make that engaging for all the students? Are there ways to make it more engaging than just read a paper or watch this video? You know, what if it's reading and responding and taking notes? We have some tools we can use that allow people to take notes on a paper they're reading in a web browser, and then that can be shared with other people. So you can make that kind of engaging for students in all the modes. Assessing learning. What about the learning? And it's not just the formal learning, it's also the informal learning, the formative evaluation. How do we do that in ways that are engaging for all the students? And then engaging students themselves, just in general engagement. Well, what are we doing for the classroom? Are we using discussions? What about online? Are we using discussions? Okay, what else are we doing besides that? And so there are different techniques and tools you can use for that. So for example, let me just talk real briefly about some of the other ways of engagement. So we're asking students to engage with content and with each other and with the faculty members. So in a classroom, you're probably used to talking to students. Are they talking back to you? We try to use the techniques of an active learning classroom in person, and we then translate those to the online synchronous space, because when we're doing kind of breakout discussions in the classroom, we can do breakout discussions online. I don't usually try to mix the online students in with the face-to-face students, because it's very difficult to manage the audio in that situation. So I have online groups in the online breakout rooms and face-to-face groups in the classroom, but they're all taking notes and reporting out through one shared Google document. And then we use that for our debrief. And then asynchronous students later, they come in, they listen to the classroom debrief. We don't record the breakout discussions, but we do record the debrief, and then they add their own notes to that same document. So at the end, we have one document everyone's contributed to, so that creates an engagement experience for them, and they're across all the modes. When I'm the other important thing I'll say about this is when I have students talking to me in the classroom, I also want students talking to me online. So we have online discussions. Those online discussions, if I only have them for online asynchronous students, it tends to be a smaller group of students, and it's not a very good discussion. And so what I do instead is have my whole class assigned to do that same online discussion. So we're all talking together between class sessions, like from a Wednesday to a Wednesday, about the same topic. And these are applied concepts for what we talked about in class. The classroom discussions are usually more basic definitions, concepts, because the students aren't often that well prepared. Even if they are, we want to make sure they've got the basics. So we talk about that more in class. Online, we talk more about applying these ideas. It's like the backwards of the flip, quite honestly. But we do that all together. And so that creates an engagement for them that goes across all modes. When we're in the classroom, online synchronous, what we're doing in the classroom typically works pretty well online synchronously. I want those students online to interact. And if I just have them listening for 45 minutes, or even in my classes up to 2 hours, we might be together, that's not going to be good for anybody. And so I do 2 or 3 different interactive exercises with them, with all the students, in person and online synchronously during that time period. One is usually a breakout room activity of some sort. Another one is I use a tool like Mentimeter or Kahoot or something else that requires them to log in to an online space, and they answer questions. And sometimes I'll integrate those into a presentation. So we're all doing that together, and that creates a record of that. And then the asynchronous students later, they will listen to and they'll watch the recording of the presentation. They have the slides if we use slides. And then they're also required to come back into that tool and add their own answers to those questions. So once again, everyone's doing the same experience, just at different times. So that creates a more engagement for them. And so the online participation for the synchronous students, they know that if I call on them, they have to be ready to respond. And I expect their response to have their camera on. Not always, they don't always put cameras on. I don't require it, because sometimes there's a good reason for them to have a camera off. But it's certainly part of the expectation. So I treat them as if they're in the physical classroom. If I'm asking questions of the students in front of me, I'm going to ask questions of the students, specifically calling them out, especially if I haven't heard from them. Or I'll ask them to put it into the chat, those kinds of things. So there are a lot of different tools that we can use for that. Online asynchronously, the biggest challenge here is to make sure you have enough students participating online asynchronously. And that's where I have all the students in classes out there. And I have to be part of that conversation. I have to be facilitating the discussion. So several times a week, every other day, there's a little note in my calendar: go online to interact in the forums, go online to interact in the forums. Because if I don't put that into my calendar, I might forget. I can't even believe myself that I would forget I had online students in the forums. but it happens. And so I make sure it's in there for an hour every other day. So that's like 3 hours a week. And it's not, I don't spend a whole hour for every class. Sometimes it's only 20 minutes, but I'm making sure that I'm part of those threads that have been developing of students talking to each other about the ideas. So I think all of these tools can really help. It does still require students to make the choice to interact. Students have to choose to participate. Even though you have wonderful designs and you're there facilitating, you're pulling them in. Sometimes they're very resistant. And there are some cases where you said, well, they're not going to participate. And what I try to do to motivate in my classes, I give them a large part of their grade, like up to 30% of their grade is participation in different ways. So they have to show up, right? But showing up is also interacting with us while they're showing up. There's the online discussion they have to do. And I also do an online reflection form, like an open journal for every student every week, where they log in, they reply to their own thread. They tell me how they're learning, not what they're learning, but the process of learning. And they give me suggestions on how it might be better for them. And they do that every week. So all of that's 30% of their grade. Most of my students will participate because they don't want to give up a big part of their grade. These are even grad students. Even graduate students work for points. I found that out. I can't give them chocolate, so I give them points.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to another question right away, because we have just about 4 minutes again. All right, so Mrs. Sandra Fagara Henry, she's asking about if you could compare the use of the Hyflex design for elementary as opposed to the high school educators. And another question she's asking, any advice for the elementary or the early childhood care and education teachers?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you for asking it. I think the biggest question I would have is why would we need this flexibility for those students? And that's the question of the day, really, is making sure that there's an important reason why this would be helpful for them. It's not something that I would actually recommend for anyone just to do because someone tells them to do it, or because it's just a new thing to do. But if there's a good reason why you have to be able to support students who are there in person and students who are remote online, in whatever case it might be, now we need to find a solution. And a lot of the things that we would do similarly here, and what we did in the past with those students when they were primarily Zoom students, some of that might actually work. So using the best practices, the flexibility component is probably one of the things that's most questionable. And I think it may really come down to the family. Does the family need to have the student at home, or the fact that the student can't get to the campus? Is that the primary driver? And so then it's a matter of the family being able to commit to making sure that the student is being facilitated, especially at the younger ages. I don't think we can rely on many of those students be very highly independent, motivated learners. So they typically need someone there to facilitate their learning, not being left alone for a couple of hours just to learn, or even just to watch a teacher in the classroom that's on the screen. Doesn't work very well, right? So they need to have that person with them. And so those are some of the things that would come into it. I think it can work, but I don't have any direct experience at that level, and it has to rely more on the motivation of whoever's there locally, typically a parent or a guardian or some caretaker, to be actively engaged with that student. Because students, the younger we get, typically, the more facilitation that is typically required to help them through the learning process. All right, our adults, we can often give them, here's a reading assignment, here's a writing assignment, go do it. Many of them will do that. Younger kids, not so much. And I think we've all kind of lived through that.
Okay,
I'm sorry, I can't say more about that.
We have one more question before we wrap up this morning, coming from Crystal Washington. And she asks, has there been any independent program evaluation to determine the quality of learner outcomes in the Hyflex modality?
Yeah, that's a good question. There have been a lot of evaluations, and there hasn't been a formal evaluation like a national study on any of this. However, here in the Hyflex learning community, I'm just going to show you where this is. There's a bibliography we put together just by searching through the database of all the published literature, especially in education. And this is just searching for Hyflex or hybrid flexible. There are other people who use the same approaches but call it something else. But in this list alone, there's at least 130 studies, and many of these there's at least a half a dozen dissertations, and there's at least a half a dozen master's theses. There are literature reviews, and so there's a lot that's been looked at. And almost all of these are talking about basically what we did, how well students learned, and how satisfied they were. And some of them go into other areas as well, but almost always we're looking at learning outcomes and satisfaction. And in those situations, almost always across the board, students are satisfied and the learning is as good or better than it was before in the single mode class. And usually there's no distinction between the various modes of participation. Now, if you're an educational researcher, that probably shouldn't surprise you very much, because you can understand there's so many other variables that control learning. The mode of participation is just one of the important ones. And so there are other things that are important. What we also find is that when we redesign a course for Hyflex, we often redesign the face-to-face component as well. We make the course better and more engaging across the board. And so it makes some sense that we would get better learning overall, or at least not any worse learning, because we're paying more attention to engagement, to interaction, and to those kinds of things. So yeah, I would say to take a look through this literature list, do some searching. You can search in the topic area you're looking for, maybe the level, but this is graduate level, this is undergraduate level, this is what we call community college or junior college level. I don't know if there's any high school studies in there. I don't remember. But there's research from the US, from the Western Hemisphere, but also from the Southern Hemisphere. There's also from Europe and Asia studies as well.
Thank you very much, Professor Beatty.